History often dazzles us with tales of grandeur. Empires rising in glory, monarchs ruling with absolute authority, artists crafting timeless masterpieces, and writers penning works that echo through the centuries. Few historical periods have captured the imagination as powerfully as Spain's so-called Golden Age. Stretching across the 16th and 17th centuries, this era is often painted in strokes of gold, rich in cultural achievement, global conquest, and spiritual intensity. Names like Cervantes, Velázquez, Lope de Vega, and El Greco have become immortal, symbolizing the artistic and intellectual brilliance that characterized the time. Spain, it is said, ruled not only with swords and ships, but with pens, brushes, and prayers. But behind the glittering surface of this celebrated age lies a deeper, more complex reality, one filled with contradictions, silences, and shadows. What if the stories we've been told are only part of the picture? What if, beneath the stunning cathedrals and imperial palaces, there were hidden voices, unheard struggles, and untold costs? What did life look like for the peasant who tilled the land, the indigenous person under colonial rule, or the woman cloistered in a convent, writing verses by candlelight? Was this truly a golden time for all, or only for the few who could afford to leave their mark on history? And more importantly, what does it mean when we label any period as golden? Who decides which moments in history shine the brightest, and which are left in the dark? Modern scholars are revisiting this storied past, peeling back layers of myth and national pride to reveal a more nuanced, human story. They are no longer content to speak only of kings and conquerors. They are listening to the voices of ordinary people, of those marginalized and overlooked, of those who resisted, adapted, or simply endured. They are asking difficult questions about the legacy of empire, the cost of cultural dominance, and the complex role that religion played in shaping Spanish society. They are challenging us to see the Spanish Golden Age not as a single, shining moment frozen in time, but as a dynamic, contradictory era. Rich with achievement, yes, but also rife with tension, struggle, and change. In this journey through Spain's most celebrated epoch, we will explore not just the triumphs, but the truths behind them. We'll uncover the stories hidden in plain sight, the voices long silenced, and the realities that history books often fail to mention. Because to truly understand the past, we must look beyond the surface and embrace the complexity that lies beneath. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, where we unravel the past with clarity, curiosity, and care. In this video, we'll dive into the myths and realities of Spain's Golden Age, exploring how this famed period of cultural brilliance was shaped, who benefited, who was left behind, and why it continues to matter today. Stay with us as we explore history not just as it was told, but as it was lived. The term Golden Age evokes grandeur, prosperity, and a flourishing of culture, power, and intellect. It is often associated with periods in history seen as pinnacles of national achievement or cultural output. In the context of Spain, the Golden Age has become a widely accepted way of referring to an era spanning roughly the 16th and 17th centuries, marked by the flowering of Spanish art, literature, and imperial power. However, like many historical labels, the phrase Golden Age did not emerge contemporaneously with the events it describes, but was rather coined and popularized later, shaped by a mixture of national pride, literary imagination, and political myth-making. The romanticized image of Spain during this time, bolstered by legends of heroic conquistadors, the literary brilliance of Cervantes and Lope de Vega, and the dazzling paintings of El Greco and Velázquez, obscures a more complex and often contradictory historical reality. To understand how this Golden Age narrative came to be, it is necessary to explore its linguistic origin, its adoption into popular consciousness, and the cultural artifacts that helped cement its enduring legacy. The phrase Golden Age has classical roots. Ancient Greek and Roman writers employed the term to describe an idealized past, a time of peace, prosperity, and moral virtue, often contrasted with the perceived corruption of their present. The Roman poet Ovid, for instance, described a mythical golden age in his Metamorphoses, where people lived in harmony, without need for laws, weapons, or property. This image of a bygone era of perfection became a literary trope throughout antiquity, and was later revived by Renaissance humanists who sought to emulate classical ideals. When writers and historians began referring to Spain's flourishing in the 16th and 17th centuries as a golden age, they drew consciously on this classical imagery. However, unlike the mythic age of Ovid, Spain's golden age was a historical period filled with both glory and hardship. The coining and popularization of the term as it relates to Spain gained momentum in the 18th and 19th centuries, long after the actual events had transpired. Spanish intellectuals, looking back at the cultural output of the past, used the term to describe what they saw as the apex of Spanish achievement. This retrospective idealization was not uncommon. Nations in post-imperial or declining phases often look backward to construct narratives of former greatness. In Spain's case, this meant viewing the reigns of Charles V and Philip II as moments of unmatched grandeur, when the Spanish Empire stretched across continents and Spanish culture reached its zenith. The rise of historical novels, patriotic histories, and romanticized accounts of the past helped to spread this term. By the late 19th century, the term had entered common usage in academic and public discourse alike. Literature played a central role in constructing the mythic image of this age. Miguel de Cervantes, often considered the greatest Spanish writer, published Don Quixote at the beginning of the 17th century. This novel, frequently cited as the first modern novel in European literature, combined biting satire with nostalgic idealism. Though Cervantes himself was deeply aware of Spain's internal contradictions, its fading chivalric ideals, economic struggles, and social unrest, his work was later interpreted as emblematic of Spain's literary and cultural vitality during its golden age. Similarly, Lope de Vega, whose prolific output revolutionized Spanish theater, became another pillar of this cultural mythology. His plays, filled with themes of honor, love, and national pride, created a dramatic mirror that reflected Spain's ambitions and anxieties alike. The sheer volume of his work, combined with its dramatic inventiveness, made him a symbol of creative abundance. In visual arts, figures like El Greco and Diego Velázquez contributed to the glorification of this era. El Greco's elongated, expressive forms and spiritual intensity came to represent the deeply religious character of Spanish society, while Velázquez's court paintings, particularly Las Meninas, demonstrated both technical mastery and a subtle commentary on power and perception. These artists were later hailed as visual embodiments of Spain's cultural supremacy. Their works displayed not just as aesthetic masterpieces, but as national treasures. The elevation of these artists in modern times reinforced the notion of a Spanish Renaissance, in which art and literature blossomed in tandem with imperial power. But the romanticization of Spain's golden age often glossed over the harsh realities of the time. Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries was marked by intense social inequalities, religious persecution, and economic instability. The wealth flowing from the Americas, much of it acquired through the exploitation and destruction of indigenous civilizations, created an illusion of endless prosperity. However, this influx of silver and gold also led to inflation, fiscal mismanagement, and a long-term weakening of the domestic economy. By the end of the 17th century, Spain's imperial dominance was already waning, and its internal structures were strained by debt, corruption, and rigid social hierarchies. Religious orthodoxy also contributed to the darker side of the era. The Inquisition, established in the late 15th century, continued to enforce Catholic conformity through censorship, torture, and execution. Intellectual life was often stifled, as alternative viewpoints were deemed heretical. While Spain did produce brilliant scholars and theologians, the broader climate was one of suspicion and repression. Yet, in the myth of the Golden Age, this religious fervor was often reimagined as moral clarity or spiritual greatness, downplaying the human cost. Military exploits, too, were rebranded through the lens of heroism. The conquests of the Americas by figures like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro were initially chronicled as daring adventures. Over time, these narratives were further idealized, with the conquistadors depicted as brave and divinely chosen agents of civilization and Christianity. Such portrayals ignored or sanitized the violence, exploitation, and genocide that accompanied the colonization of the New World. Still, these stories became foundational myths for Spain's national identity, helping to construct a narrative of exceptionalism and divine favor. This myth-making was not accidental. It served both political and cultural purposes. During times of national crisis or decline, such as the loss of colonial territories in the 19th century or the political instability of the early 20th, the Golden Age narrative provided a source of consolation and inspiration. It reminded Spaniards of a time when their country had been powerful and respected. In education, literature, and public monuments, the heroes and artists of this era were celebrated and mythologized. Their accomplishments became symbols of what Spain had been, and what it could, in theory, become again. Foreign observers also played a role in shaping the romantic image of Spain. Travelers from France, England, and later the United States often viewed Spain through a lens of exoticism and nostalgia. 19th-century Romantic writers and painters depicted Spanish landscapes as timeless, Spanish people as passionate and proud, and Spanish history as a tragic epic. These portrayals, while sometimes critical, often contributed to the idealized version of the Golden Age. Operas, novels, and paintings set in historical Spain featured tormented heroes, devout nuns, and dueling hidalgos. These images reinforced the idea of a dramatic and culturally rich past, even if they bore little resemblance to the complex realities of 16th or 17th century Spain. The endurance of the Golden Age narrative owes much to the power of culture and memory. In modern Spain, the legacy of this period continues to be debated, taught, and invoked. The names of Cervantes, Velázquez, and Teresa of Avila are still revered, their works studied as monuments of national genius. Museums, universities, and festivals commemorate the achievements of this era, often without deeply questioning the contradictions it contains. For some, the Golden Age remains a proud emblem of Spanish identity. For others, it is a symbol of imperial ambition and cultural conservatism. In recent decades, historians have worked to complicate the traditional narrative. Scholars have highlighted the diversity of experiences during this time, including the roles of marginalized groups such as women, Jews, Muslims, and indigenous peoples in the empire's story. They have examined how Spain's cultural output often reflected tensions, anxieties, and unresolved conflicts. By focusing on the ambiguities and contradictions of the era, these historians aim to move beyond myth and toward a more nuanced understanding of Spain's past. Yet myths are resilient. The idea of a golden age offers a compelling story, a rise to greatness, a flourishing of genius, and an eventual fall that is as poetic as it is tragic. This narrative appeals to the human desire for meaning, coherence, and legacy. Whether in textbooks, national celebrations, or tourist brochures, the myth of Spain's Golden Age continues to captivate. It presents an image of cultural radiance amid historical shadows, a vision of national identity forged through both brilliance and illusion. Even as modern Spain grapples with its pluralism, regional identities, and post-colonial legacy, the echoes of the Golden Age remain. Statues stand in plazas, ancient manuscripts are preserved in libraries, and the names of poets, kings, and painters still evoke a sense of pride. The phrase itself, though invented long after the fact, has become inseparable from how the era is remembered. It is a powerful reminder that history is not only what happened, but also how we choose to remember what happened. The construction of a golden age was not just about glorifying the past. It was about shaping the present and imagining the future. The Golden Age of Spain is both real and imagined. It was an age of extraordinary cultural production and imperial expansion, but also of suffering, inequality, and decline. Its romanticized image was built over centuries through literature, art, political narrative, and national longing. The phrase Golden Age endures not because it tells the whole truth, but because it offers a story worth telling, a story of greatness, struggle, and the human desire to find meaning in the passage of time. The term Golden Age often evokes a picture of opulence, artistic brilliance, and imperial triumph. In the case of Spain, this phrase has long been associated with a period stretching across the 16th and 17th centuries, celebrated for its literary giants, stunning visual art, military victories, and the expansion of a global empire. However, beneath the glittering surface of this so-called age of splendor lay deep and persistent contradictions that are essential to understanding the reality of Spanish society during that time. The myth of a harmonious and flourishing Spain during its golden age obscures the lived experiences of millions of people, many of whom were subjected to social inequality, economic instability, colonial exploitation, and institutional repression. A closer, more critical examination of this period reveals that the narrative of a perfect and prosperous Spain masks a more fragmented and troubled reality. Beneath the cultural radiance and imperial pride that dominated official portrayals of the period, Spanish society was marked by striking inequalities. The economic benefits of Spain's vast empire did not trickle down to the majority of its population. While the aristocracy, clergy, and royal family enriched themselves from the flow of silver and gold arriving from the Americas, most Spaniards continued to live in conditions of poverty or modest subsistence. The peasantry, which made up the bulk of the population, struggled under heavy taxation and a rigid feudal system that offered little opportunity for social mobility. The burden of empire building, while celebrated in court and cathedral, was borne disproportionately by the common people, who funded wars through taxes, fought on distant battlefields, and worked the fields under increasingly harsh conditions. In urban centers, especially cities like Seville and Madrid, the disparities were no less pronounced. While wealthy merchants and nobles built lavish homes and patronized the arts, the streets outside teemed with beggars, day laborers, and the unemployed. The urban poor were frequently the victims of disease, malnutrition, and exploitation, and their suffering was exacerbated by a government more concerned with maintaining the image of imperial grandeur than addressing the needs of its people. Even the famed artistic and literary achievements of the period must be viewed in this context. Many of the artists and writers celebrated today struggled financially during their lifetimes, and their works often reflected themes of disillusionment, inequality, and moral decay. The plays of Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca, while staged in royal courts, also resonated with the anxieties of an audience familiar with social injustice. The characters they created, honorable commoners, corrupted nobles, and trickster servants, revealed a society riddled with contradictions. Spain's economy during the so-called Golden Age was paradoxically one of both immense wealth and chronic instability. The riches flowing in from the colonies, particularly silver from mines in Potosi and Zacatecas, allowed the Spanish crown to finance its wars in Europe and support an elaborate court culture. But this wealth created more illusions than solutions. Rather than investing in local industries or improving agricultural productivity, much of the empire's income was squandered on military campaigns, royal extravagance, and the repayment of debts to foreign bankers. As a result, Spain became increasingly dependent on its colonial holdings, even as its domestic economy weakened. Inflation soared during the 16th century, particularly after the large-scale importation of silver. This phenomenon, often referred to as the price revolution, disproportionately affected the poor, whose wages did not keep pace with the rising cost of living. Artisans and small merchants found it difficult to compete with imported luxury goods, while agriculture suffered from a lack of innovation and investment. The reliance on forced labor in the colonies further hindered the development of a diversified, modern economy back home. As Spain poured its energies into maintaining control of its far-flung empire, other European nations began to surpass it in terms of commercial innovation and industrial growth. The glittering wealth that so fascinated Spanish and foreign observers alike came largely from the exploitation of colonized peoples. The conquest of the Americas, which began in the late 15th century, unleashed a tidal wave of violence, enslavement, and cultural destruction. Indigenous civilizations were decimated through war, disease, and forced labor. The encomienda system, established to extract tribute and labor from native populations, effectively turned vast numbers of people into serfs for Spanish settlers. In Peru and Mexico, indigenous workers were compelled to toil in mines under brutal conditions, extracting the silver that funded Spain's imperial ventures. The wealth generated from this exploitation allowed the crown to project power across Europe, but it came at the cost of countless lives and the destruction of entire societies. Imprisoned Africans also played a crucial role in the Spanish colonial economy, particularly in the Caribbean and parts of South America. Although Spain was not the largest participant in the transatlantic slave trade compared to Portugal or later Britain, it nonetheless relied heavily on enslaved labor to sustain its plantations and mining operations. The suffering endured by these populations is seldom acknowledged in traditional narratives of the Golden Age, which tend to focus instead on conquest, conversion, and civilization. Yet the prosperity enjoyed by the Spanish elite was intimately tied to these systems of exploitation. Without the forced labor of indigenous and African peoples, the empire's wealth would have been vastly diminished. In addition to its economic and human costs, colonialism also had deep ideological implications for Spanish identity. The empire's self-image was constructed around the twin pillars of Catholicism and royal authority. The conversion of indigenous peoples was portrayed as a divine mission, a civilizing act that justified conquest and subjugation. Religious orders like the Franciscans and Jesuits played significant roles in this process, establishing missions and schools throughout the colonies. But this evangelization was often coercive, involving the destruction of native religious practices and the imposition of European cultural norms. In Spain itself, the Inquisition sought to root out heresy and enforce religious conformity, often targeting conversos, those of Jewish or Muslim ancestry who had converted to Christianity, along with Protestants and mystics. This climate of suspicion and control stifled intellectual inquiry and fostered an atmosphere of fear and repression. The limitations of the Golden Age narrative become increasingly evident when one considers the broader spectrum of Spanish history. By focusing almost exclusively on cultural achievements and imperial expansion, this narrative neglects the complexities and contradictions of the era. It presents a sanitized version of history that omits the voices of the oppressed, the impoverished, and the colonized. It also obscures the structural weaknesses that led to Spain's eventual decline as a world power. The reliance on colonial wealth, the failure to invest in sustainable economic development, and the rigid social hierarchies all contributed to a slow but steady erosion of Spain's global standing. Moreover, the Golden Age narrative reinforces a simplistic view of historical progress. It implies a peak followed by a fall, a rise in glory followed by inevitable decline. But history is rarely so linear. Spain's cultural and political development did not end with the 17th century, nor did its earlier centuries lack significance. By isolating this period and labeling it as uniquely golden, historians and educators risk marginalizing other important moments in the Spanish past, including the diverse contributions of Al-Andalus, the complexities of medieval kingdoms, and the transformations brought by the modern era. There is also the issue of regional diversity within Spain itself. The Golden Age narrative often centers on Castile and its imperial ambitions, sidelining the experiences of other regions such as Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Andalusia. These areas had their own histories, cultures, and conflicts, many of which did not align neatly with the dominant imperial narrative. By promoting a singular vision of Spanish greatness, the Golden Age story simplifies a far more nuanced and pluralistic national identity. This oversimplification has had lasting effects on how Spaniards understand their past and relate to their present. In more recent years, historians have worked to dismantle the mythology surrounding Spain's Golden Age by emphasizing the era's contradictions. They have shown how the very works of art and literature used to celebrate the period often contain embedded critiques of social inequality, religious hypocrisy, and political corruption. Cervantes' Don Quixote, for example, is not merely a tribute to chivalric ideals, but also a satirical reflection on the absurdities of those ideals in a rapidly changing world. The character of Don Quixote, both noble and delusional, serves as a metaphor for a society caught between outdated traditions and emerging modern realities. Similarly, the paintings of Diego Velázquez offer more than just regal grandeur. Works like Las Meninas explore themes of perception, power, and illusion. While the painting appears to glorify the royal family, it subtly shifts the focus to the painter himself, inviting viewers to question the very structures of authority and representation. El Greco's mystical and often unsettling canvases express spiritual depth, but also convey the tensions of a society grappling with religious fervor and existential uncertainty. These works, far from being mere ornaments of a golden era, engage deeply with the contradictions and struggles of their time. Ultimately, the enduring appeal of the Golden Age narrative lies in its simplicity and emotional power. It offers a sense of pride, continuity, and meaning in a complex and often chaotic historical landscape. But as with any historical myth, its usefulness must be balanced against its limitations. By clinging too tightly to an idealized past, societies risk ignoring the lessons that history has to offer. Spain's Golden Age was not just a time of achievement, but also a period of profound tension, inequality, and exploitation. Recognizing these dimensions does not diminish the real accomplishments of the era. It enriches our understanding of them and places them in a fuller, more human context. A mature engagement with the past requires both admiration and critique. It means celebrating artistic and intellectual brilliance while also acknowledging the systems of power and exclusion that made such brilliance possible. It means honoring the achievements of a nation without turning a blind eye to the suffering endured by those on its margins. The Golden Age of Spain when viewed through this more critical lens, becomes not a distant dream of perfection, but a mirror reflecting the complexities of history itself. A history shaped by ambition and oppression, by vision and delusion, by beauty and brutality. In re-examining this pivotal period, we are reminded that the past is never static. It is continually reinterpreted, revised, and reframed in light of new evidence and new perspectives. The work of historians, educators, and cultural critics is not to preserve myths, but to seek understanding. And in the case of Spain's so-called Golden Age, true understanding lies not in the golden glitter, but in the shadows that it casts. By exploring beyond the surface, by listening to silenced voices and examining hidden truths, we come closer to an honest reckoning with the past, one that respects both the brilliance and the burdens of history. The idea of a golden age has, for centuries, cast a long and luminous shadow over Spanish history. While the phrase itself is rooted in mythological and classical traditions, its application to the Spanish context has become more than a simple historical label. It functions as a cornerstone in the narrative of national identity, a turning point in cultural consciousness, and a lens through which both Spain and the world have come to understand the country's historical trajectory. At the heart of this golden age is a period that roughly spans the 16th and 17th centuries, when Spain, as an emerging global empire, witnessed a remarkable flowering of literature, visual art, philosophy, and religious thought. These achievements have endured not just as relics of the past, but as active forces in shaping the nation's cultural memory and international reputation. During this period, Spanish literature underwent a transformation that would leave an indelible mark on the development of Western literary traditions. Writers like Miguel de Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Calderón de la Barca, and Tirso de Molina brought the Spanish language to new heights of expressive power and narrative complexity. Cervantes's Don Quixote, often considered the first modern novel, emerged as a foundational text not only for Spanish literature, but for world literature more broadly. Through its intricate structure, metaliterary devices, and deep psychological insight, the novel introduced a way of storytelling that would influence generations of writers across Europe and the Americas. Lope de Vega's contributions to theater were no less significant. He revolutionized the Spanish stage by crafting a uniquely national drama that combined classical rules with popular taste. His prolific output, more than 1,000 plays by some estimates, demonstrated the vitality of Spanish dramatic art during this era. What made this period transformative for literature was not merely the volume of work produced, but the ways in which these works engaged with the social, political, and moral questions of their time. Whether through the satire of Cervantes, the philosophical depth of Calderón, or the emotional intensity of Lope's characters, these authors explored themes of identity, power, honor, and disillusionment. Their literary worlds were not detached from reality, but deeply embedded in the tensions and contradictions of a rapidly changing society. The enduring power of these texts lies in their capacity to speak across time, to challenge and inspire readers long after the circumstances of their creation have passed. In the realm of visual art, the same sense of innovation and introspection characterized the work of Spanish painters. El Greco, though born in Crete, established his artistic identity in Toledo and became one of the defining figures of Spanish painting. His elongated figures, spiritual intensity, and dramatic use of color created a style that was both deeply personal and profoundly resonant with the religious fervor of Counter-Reformation Spain. Diego Velázquez, working primarily in Madrid under the patronage of King Philip IV, brought a new level of realism and psychological depth to court portraiture. His masterpiece Las Meninas not only captures a moment in the life of the Spanish court, but also invites the viewer into a meditation on perception, power, and the role of the artist. Francisco de Zurbarán and Bartolomé Esteban Murillo contributed to the period's religious art, creating works that conveyed deep emotion and spiritual contemplation. What these artists shared, despite their differences in technique and focus, was a commitment to exploring the human condition through visual means. Their paintings did more than adorn churches and palaces. They shaped the aesthetic sensibilities of the Spanish people and projected an image of Spanish culture to the world. In doing so, they helped to define a visual identity that would be closely associated with Spanishness for centuries to come. The influence of their work extended far beyond the Iberian Peninsula, inspiring artists and collectors across Europe and leaving a legacy that remains vibrant in contemporary museums and cultural institutions. Music, too, flourished during this time, particularly in the realms of sacred and courtly composition. Composers like Tomás Luis de Victoria, Francisco Guerrero, and Alonso Lobo produced polyphonic works that were celebrated for their technical mastery and emotional depth. These compositions became part of the religious experience for many Spaniards, performed in cathedrals and monasteries, and they also contributed to the global dissemination of Spanish cultural forms, as religious missions and colonial administrators brought the music with them to the Americas and the Philippines. Philosophy and religious thought played a crucial role in shaping the intellectual landscape of the Golden Age. Figures like Francisco Suarez, a leading member of the School of Salamanca, advanced theories in law, ethics, and political philosophy that would influence European thought for generations. His ideas about natural law, sovereignty, and the rights of peoples would later be echoed in Enlightenment discourse. Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, two towering figures of Spanish mysticism, combined theological reflection with literary beauty, creating works that remained central to Christian spirituality. Their writings, rooted in personal experience and rigorous thought, continue to resonate with readers both within and outside the religious sphere. The intellectual and artistic achievements of the Golden Age were not merely national treasures. They became integral to how Spain understood itself and how it was perceived by others. These cultural forms became symbols of national pride, used to construct a narrative of exceptionalism that was deeply intertwined with the country's imperial ambitions. Over time, the legacy of the Golden Age would become a foundational element in Spanish identity. It offered a repository of values, courage, creativity, piety, honor, that could be invoked in times of crisis or transition. Even as Spain's political power waned in the centuries that followed, the memory of its cultural peak served as a touchstone for collective self-understanding. The legacy of this period also shaped Spain's relationship with the world in profound ways. As the Spanish Empire extended its reach across the Atlantic, into the Americas, and across the Pacific to the Philippines, it carried with it the cultural products of the Golden Age. Spanish became not only a language of governance and commerce, but also a vehicle for literature, religion, and philosophy. Missionaries translated religious texts, taught Spanish grammar, and introduced European art and music to indigenous populations. While this process was often coercive and destructive of native cultures, it also led to complex forms of cultural hybridity. In many parts of Latin America, for example, the literary and artistic traditions of the Spanish Golden Age became intertwined with local customs, producing new forms of expression that bore the mark of both colonial imposition and creative adaptation. As a result, the Golden Age became part of a broader Hispanic world, one that extended far beyond the borders of modern Spain. The influence of this era can be seen in the literary traditions of Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and other nations that were once part of the empire. Writers, thinkers, and artists in these regions drew on the legacy of the Golden Age, even as they developed their own distinct voices. In this way, the cultural flowering of early modern Spain contributed not only to national identity, but also to a shared transatlantic heritage that continues to shape the Spanish-speaking world. The memory of the Golden Age also affected Spain's position within Europe. During the 19th century, as nations like Britain and France sought to assert their cultural and political dominance, Spain's image often became the subject of debate. Romantic writers and travelers viewed Spain through a nostalgic lens, portraying it as a land of passion, mystery, and decline. In contrast, Spanish intellectuals sought to reclaim the legacy of the Golden Age as evidence of their country's rightful place in the pantheon of European greatness. This cultural pride became particularly important during periods of political instability, such as after the loss of Spain's last colonies in the late 19th century. The achievements of the Golden Age were held up as proof that Spain had once been, and could be again, a beacon of civilization. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the legacy of the Golden Age has continued to evolve. It remains a central subject of academic study, with scholars around the world examining the works of Cervantes, Velázquez, Teresa of Avila, and others from multiple perspectives. At the same time, public institutions in Spain, museums, schools, cultural foundations, continue to promote the legacy of this era as a source of national pride. The Prado Museum in Madrid, with its unparalleled collection of Golden Age paintings, attracts millions of visitors each year, many of whom come to see the masterpieces of a time that still defines much of Spain's cultural identity. However, this legacy is not without its critics. Some contemporary thinkers have questioned the romanticization of the Golden Age, pointing to the social injustices and imperial violence that underpinned many of its achievements. They argue that a fuller understanding of this period requires confronting its contradictions and acknowledging the voices that were excluded or silenced in traditional narratives. This critical approach does not seek to erase the accomplishments of the era, but to place them in a broader context, one that recognizes both the light and the shadows of history. As Spain continues to navigate its place in an increasingly interconnected and pluralistic world, the legacy of the Golden Age remains a source of both inspiration and introspection. It serves as a reminder of what the country once achieved, but also of the costs associated with that achievement. It challenges Spaniards to think deeply about the meanings of culture, power, identity, and memory. In doing so, it keeps alive a dialogue between past and present, between tradition and transformation. The enduring fascination with this period is perhaps best understood not as a fixation on a bygone era, but as an ongoing conversation. The works of the Golden Age continue to be read, performed, exhibited, and debated because they speak to fundamental human questions. They explore the nature of reality and illusion, the conflict between individual conscience and social duty, the longing for transcendence, and the complexities of love, honor, and faith. In this sense, their legacy is not static but dynamic, something that lives and grows with each generation that engages with it. The Golden Age of Spain was more than a moment of cultural flourishing. It was a crucible in which the modern Spanish identity was forged, a stage on which the dramas of empire, faith, and creativity were enacted. Its legacy continues to shape how Spain sees itself and how it is seen by others. Whether celebrated or critiqued, idealized or reinterpreted, the influence of this remarkable era remains woven into the fabric of Spanish life and global heritage. Its stories, images, and ideas endure, not because they belong to the past, but because they continue to speak to the present. When thinking about the so-called Golden Age of Spain, it is easy to imagine an era dominated by kings, conquistadors, artists, and poets. It is tempting to believe the narrative filled with dazzling portraits, grand military campaigns, masterful plays, and epic novels. These figures and their works have received praise for centuries, and they do hold a central place in the story of Spain's cultural and imperial rise. But hidden beneath the gold leaf of this celebrated period were the millions of ordinary people whose lives made up the fabric of Spanish society. Farmers, laborers, artisans, beggars, domestic servants, enslaved individuals, and women of all social standings lived through this same period, though their voices were often unheard or ignored in the dominant histories. Their experiences, marked by endurance, resistance, silence, and occasional bursts of recorded expression, reveal a far more complex picture of Spain's so-called Golden Age. The majority of the Spanish population during the 16th and 17th centuries lived in rural areas. These peasants were tied to the land, working the fields for their survival, and more often than not, for the enrichment of landlords. They operated under a feudal-like structure that kept them bound to noble estates or communal lands, with few rights or protections. Harvests were uncertain, dependent on weather and luck, and famines were not uncommon. The rural poor often struggled with hunger, disease, and the whims of landlords and tax collectors. While the upper classes praised the empire's glories, the people who produced its food were usually left out of the prosperity. In towns and cities, life was not necessarily better. Urban centers such as Seville, Madrid, and Toledo offered more opportunities, but also more risks. A growing population meant overcrowded housing, rising prices, and fierce competition for work. Artisans and guild members struggled to maintain stable incomes as the economy fluctuated. Many trades were tightly regulated, and those who did not belong to guilds had to navigate informal economies. Young apprentices, hoping to rise through the ranks, often faced harsh conditions and strict discipline. Meanwhile, daily wage laborers had little job security, and women working as domestic servants could be dismissed with little notice or protection. For the poor, daily life was a continuous battle against poverty and instability. Begging was widespread, and many depended on charity from religious orders or municipal institutions. Hospitals and shelters provided some relief, but they were often overcrowded and under-resourced. The state responded to poverty with a mix of religious compassion and harsh regulation. Laws were passed to limit the movement of the poor, punish vagrancy, and prevent public disorder. In this environment, survival often depended on networks of family, community, and church, as well as the ability to adapt to constantly changing circumstances. Women's experiences during this period varied significantly by class, but were generally shaped by a rigid set of gender expectations. The ideal woman was expected to be chaste, obedient, and devoted to domestic life. For upper-class women, this meant life within the confines of the home or convent, with limited education and few opportunities for independence. Marriage was often arranged, and property was typically controlled by male relatives. For lower-class women, life offered little security. Many worked as servants, laundresses, vendors, or midwives. Widowhood, abandonment, or economic hardship could push women into begging or prostitution. The state and the church placed strict controls on women's behavior, and those who defied expectations could be subject to public punishment or imprisonment. Despite these constraints, some women found ways to exert influence. Religious life provided one of the few avenues for female education and autonomy. Nuns such as Teresa of Avila not only led reforms, but also wrote profound theological texts that gained respect throughout Europe. In the popular sphere, women were central to daily life in markets, homes, and communities, even if their contributions went unrecognized by official histories. Stories of resistance, survival, and solidarity among women reveal a depth of experience often missing from grand narratives of conquest and culture. Religious minorities faced particularly harsh conditions during this era. The expulsion of Jews in the late 15th century and the forced conversions of Muslims under the Catholic monarchs did not end suspicion or persecution. Conversos, those of Jewish descent who had converted to Christianity, and Moriscos, Muslims who had done the same, were often viewed with distrust. Even generations after conversion, they were subject to scrutiny by the Inquisition, accused of secretly practicing their old faiths. The fear of heresy justified invasions into private lives, torture, and public executions. Entire communities were uprooted or destroyed in the name. The Morisco population, especially in southern regions like Andalusia, faced forced assimilation policies, language bans, and surveillance. In the early 17th century, the final expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain marked a brutal end to centuries of shared cultural history between Muslims and Christians. This expulsion was justified as necessary for religious unity, but it also had deep economic and social consequences. Moriscos had contributed to agriculture, crafts, and local economies, and their removal created labor shortages and cultural loss. Their voices were almost entirely silenced in the official record, though traces of their presence live on in language, architecture, music, and oral traditions. People of African descent, both enslaved and free, formed another marginalized group often overlooked in discussions of the Spanish Golden Age. Enslaved Africans were brought into Spain through ports such as Seville and Cadiz and were employed in a variety of roles, including domestic service, agriculture, and skilled trades. Though slavery in Spain was somewhat different from that in the colonies, it was no less degrading or dehumanizing. Enslaved individuals could sometimes earn their freedom, but their legal and social status remained precarious. Free black Spaniards formed communities, sometimes joining brotherhoods and religious societies, and made contributions to urban life, though their experiences were shaped by exclusion, stereotyping, and limited opportunity. Indigenous peoples in the colonies were also part of this broader story, even if geographically distant from the Iberian Peninsula. Under Spanish rule, native societies in the Americas were subjected to forced labor, cultural suppression, and Christianization. The encomienda and repartimiento systems ensured that indigenous labor supported the wealth of the empire. Spanish officials justified these systems with religious rhetoric, claiming to bring salvation and civilization while exploiting native communities. Yet indigenous resistance never fully ceased. From armed uprisings to subtle forms of cultural survival, native peoples fought to preserve their ways of life. Some became allies, interpreters, or intermediaries, navigating a complex world between domination and autonomy. A more nuanced view of the Spanish Golden Age emerges when these diverse experiences are considered. The celebrated figures of the era did not live in a vacuum. Cervantes, for instance, knew poverty and war. His own life was marked by captivity, debt, and struggle. The characters he created, mad knights, cunning servants, defiant women, mirrored the complexities of real society. Lope de Vega, who was both a soldier and a priest, drew inspiration from the streets as much as the palace. His plays gave voice to everyday people and exposed the moral contradictions of the powerful. These writers succeeded, in part, because they understood the full spectrum of human experience in their time. Everyday people also left traces of their lives in letters, legal documents, wills, petitions, and oral traditions. Though rarely preserved or celebrated, these materials provide insight into the daily rhythms of life. They reveal how people coped with illness, injustice, and loss. They show how communities formed, adapted, and resisted. Court records, for instance, contain stories of women demanding support from absent husbands, workers seeking payment for labor, and neighbors testifying in conflicts over property and honor. These fragments, though often shaped by the language of authority, give glimpses into the lives of people who would otherwise remain invisible. The church played a central role in the lives of ordinary Spaniards. It was both a source of spiritual guidance and a mechanism of control. Religious festivals punctuated the calendar, offering moments of joy and community alongside sermons and processions. Saints' days, processions, and local devotions created shared cultural experiences. At the same time, the church enforced orthodoxy through confession, penance, and surveillance. Parish priests recorded births, marriages, and deaths, linking individuals to the institutional framework of the state. Monasteries and convents served as centers of charity, education, and refuge, but they also reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. The Spanish Inquisition, feared for its secrecy and severity, loomed large over daily life. Though not as omnipresent as sometimes imagined, it had a real impact on cultural expression, personal behavior, and intellectual freedom. Books were censored, conversations monitored, and people accused on the basis of rumor or envy. Even those not directly targeted lived with the awareness that deviation from orthodoxy could have severe consequences. Despite all these challenges, ordinary people found ways to create meaning, maintain dignity, and build community. Folk traditions, music, storytelling, and festivals allowed people to express their identities and preserve their cultures. These forms of expression, often dismissed by elites, were rich with symbolism, humor, and resilience. They served not only as entertainment, but also as social commentary and cultural resistance. Language, too, reflected this diversity. Regional dialects, idioms, and slang preserved local identities and resisted centralization. Oral traditions kept alive the histories, legends, and lessons that formal institutions ignored. Women passed down stories, songs, and recipes. Workers shared jokes and sayings. These everyday practices were part of a living culture, dynamic and responsive to change. In looking beyond the elite, a richer and more accurate portrait of the Spanish Golden Age begins to emerge. It was not only a time of greatness for kings, generals, and poets. It was also a time of endurance for the poor, struggle for the oppressed, and creativity for those living at the margins. Their lives may not have been gilded, but they were real and full of meaning. Understanding this period through the lens of ordinary people invites a re-evaluation of what makes an age truly golden. If greatness is measured only by conquest and cultural output, then the era may seem to shine. But if it is measured by justice, equity, and the well-being of all its people, then the gold begins to tarnish. This perspective does not deny the achievements of the time. It places them in context, alongside the lives and voices of those who made them possible, supported them from below, or were excluded from their rewards. By listening to these forgotten voices, by reading between the lines of official documents, and paying attention to the margins of history, we gain a deeper, more human understanding of the past. The Spanish Golden Age was not a single story but many intertwined. It was made not only by those who ruled and wrote, but by those who sewed, stitched, served, and suffered. Their legacy, too, deserves recognition. In honoring their stories, we come closer to a history that is not only rich, but also true. The Spanish Golden Age has long stood as one of the most celebrated and romanticized epochs in the history of Spain. It evokes images of literary masterpieces, majestic paintings, imperial conquest, and religious devotion. Traditionally, this term has been applied to the 16th and 17th centuries, a time when Spain appeared to be at the height of its global influence and cultural power. From the poetry of Garcilaso de la Vega to the plays of Lope de Vega, from the philosophical musings of Francisco Suarez to the portraits of Diego Velázquez, the period seems to represent a golden moment in time, a flourishing of genius and greatness that defined a nation's soul. Yet in recent decades, a growing body of modern research and scholarship has begun to challenge this traditional view. Scholars today ask not just what was accomplished during this period, but at what cost and for whom. They question the foundations of the so-called golden label, scrutinizing both what it includes and what it excludes. The term itself, though evocative, implies an idealization. It suggests a level of perfection, harmony, and prosperity that, when examined closely, does not align with the full reality of the time. Modern scholars recognize that while the upper strata of Spanish society experienced moments of grandeur, large segments of the population faced poverty, repression, and marginalization. The very achievements that are celebrated, military conquest, religious orthodoxy, colonial expansion, and artistic brilliance, were often built on the suffering and exploitation of others. This deeper understanding of historical context shifts the focus from glorification to critical analysis, opening the door for reinterpretation and deeper inquiry. One of the main shifts in contemporary research is the effort to decenter the elite narrative that has dominated historical accounts for centuries. Traditional histories often focused on monarchs, military leaders, and cultural luminaries. But modern historians have increasingly turned their attention to the everyday lives of peasants, laborers, women, indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and religious minorities. By examining legal records, personal letters, church documents, and oral traditions, they have uncovered the voices of those long excluded from the official story. These voices present a more diverse and complex view of the period. They reveal how ordinary people navigated social constraints, resisted domination, and contributed in unseen ways to the cultural landscape. In this new perspective, the Spanish Empire is no longer portrayed solely as a triumphant force spreading civilization, but as a multifaceted institution characterized by violence, exploitation, and contradiction. The conquest of the Americas, long celebrated in nationalist narratives, is now recognized as a process that resulted in the destruction of indigenous cultures, the spread of disease, and the establishment of systems of forced labor. The flow of silver and gold into Spain, once seen as a source of wealth and prestige, is now understood to have contributed to economic instability, inflation, and the eventual weakening of the Spanish economy. Scholars argue that the dependence on colonial riches distracted Spain from investing in domestic production and innovation, leaving the country vulnerable to decline. The reevaluation of religious practices during the Golden Age also forms an important part of modern scholarship. The role of the Catholic Church and the Spanish Inquisition, previously viewed as pillars of moral and national unity, are now analyzed through the lens of control, censorship, and persecution. The drive for religious uniformity resulted in the expulsion of Jews and Muslims, the forced conversion of entire populations, and the silencing of dissenting voices. While religious figures such as Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross continue to be admired for their spiritual insight and literary skill, their work is now contextualized within a broader atmosphere of repression and institutional authority. This perspective does not diminish their achievements but adds nuance to their stories, recognizing both their brilliance and the constraints under which they operated. A key development in recent scholarship is the inclusion of global perspectives. Historians increasingly study Spain not in isolation, but as part of a connected world. The empire's relationships with Africa, the Americas, Asia, and other parts of Europe are now central to understanding the period. This approach reveals how Spain was shaped by its interactions with diverse peoples and cultures. It highlights the processes of cultural exchange, resistance, and hybridity that took place in the colonies and at home. For example, scholars have shown how indigenous traditions influenced religious practices in Latin America, or how enslaved Africans brought musical and linguistic forms that enriched local cultures. Such findings emphasize that the empire was not a monologue but a dialogue, albeit often an unequal one. Moreover, critical reassessments of the Golden Age ask us to reflect on the nature of historical memory itself. What does it mean to call a time or a place golden? Who decides what is remembered and what is forgotten? These questions challenge the assumptions that have shaped textbooks, museum exhibitions, and public monuments for generations. By questioning the dominant narrative, scholars encourage a more democratic and inclusive approach to history. They invite citizens to participate in the ongoing process of remembering, interpreting, and learning from the past. Revisiting historical events through a critical lens is not simply an academic exercise. It has practical and moral implications for the present and future. It allows societies to confront past injustices and to recognize the contributions of those who were excluded from the official record. In the context of Spain, this means acknowledging the cultural richness of Sephardic Jews, the scientific and artistic achievements of Al-Andalus, the resilience of indigenous communities in the Americas, and the lived experiences of marginalized groups throughout history. It also means examining how the legacy of the Golden Age continues to influence national identity, public policy, and international relations. In today's Spain, debates over history are far from abstract. They play out in school curricula, in political discourse, and in cultural institutions. Questions about regional autonomy, national unity, immigration, and cultural diversity are often tied to historical narratives. The way the Golden Age is remembered can shape attitudes toward these issues. For example, presenting the period solely as a time of Catholic and Castilian dominance may marginalize the histories of Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Andalusia. By contrast, a more inclusive narrative that recognizes Spain's historical diversity can foster a more open and pluralistic national identity. The memory of the Golden Age also affects how Spain presents itself to the world. The country often draws on its cultural heritage to promote tourism, diplomacy, and international collaboration. References to Cervantes, Velázquez, and the Golden Period appear in branding, festivals, and cultural exchanges. While these references can inspire pride and admiration, they can also gloss over historical complexities. A critical engagement with the past can help ensure that these representations are both accurate and respectful, acknowledging the full spectrum of experiences that shaped the era. The reassessment of the Golden Age further encourages reflection on the broader themes of empire, power, and cultural achievement. It prompts questions about how greatness is defined and at what cost it is pursued. It invites comparison with other imperial histories and with contemporary forms of cultural and economic dominance. These reflections are particularly relevant in a global context marked by rising inequality, cultural homogenization, and environmental crisis. They remind us that history is not a distant realm, but a mirror through which we can examine our own values, choices, and responsibilities. From a modern perspective, the Spanish Golden Age becomes less a pedestal of perfection and more a prism through which to view a complex and contested past. It remains a time of extraordinary artistic and intellectual production, but it is now seen as one part of a larger story, one that includes voices of dissent, episodes of injustice, and movements of resistance. It is a period rich with lessons, not only about what was achieved, but also about what was lost, silenced, or ignored. This more critical and inclusive approach does not strip the era of its importance. Rather, it enhances our understanding by bringing depth, context, and diversity to the narrative. It allows for a richer engagement with the past, one that respects complexity and embraces the multiplicity of experiences. In doing so, it offers a model for how to study and remember any period of history, not as a static set of facts, but as a dynamic process of inquiry, interpretation, and reflection. The reevaluation of Spain's Golden Age is not about rejecting the past, but about engaging with it more honestly. It is about recognizing both the brilliance and the brutality, the triumphs and the traumas. It is about moving beyond myth to meaning, beyond nostalgia to understanding. In doing so, we not only gain insight into a pivotal era, but also develop the tools to think critically about our own time. We learn to question inherited stories, to listen to forgotten voices, and to seek out the connections between past and present. Such a perspective can inspire a more thoughtful and compassionate future. It reminds us that greatness is not only measured by power or prestige, but by the ways in which a society includes, uplifts, and remembers all of its members. The Spanish Golden Age, viewed through modern eyes, becomes not just a moment of cultural flowering, but a starting point for ongoing dialogue. It becomes a chapter in a longer story, one that continues to unfold, shaped by the questions we ask, the values we hold, and the histories we choose to tell. In revisiting the Spanish Golden Age through the lens of modern scholarship, a far more layered and complex picture emerges than the long-held idealized version suggests. While the era undoubtedly produced remarkable achievements in literature, art, philosophy, and global influence, it also rested on deep contradictions: economic fragility, social inequality, colonial violence, and cultural suppression. The term Golden Age, though evocative and widely used, conceals as much as it reveals. It elevates elite contributions while overlooking the lived realities of ordinary people and marginalized communities, both within Spain and across its vast empire. Contemporary research challenges the singular, celebratory narrative by including diverse voices and acknowledging the costs of imperial expansion and religious orthodoxy. This broader understanding does not diminish the era's accomplishments. Rather, it enriches them by placing them in their full historical context. It encourages a more inclusive and critical way of thinking about national identity, historical memory, and cultural heritage. The Spanish Golden Age becomes not just a period to admire, but a mirror through which Spain, and the world, can reflect on the complexity of power, the fragility of greatness, and the enduring importance of telling history with both truth and depth. It serves as a reminder that the past is not fixed but always open to reinterpretation, and that by revisiting it thoughtfully, societies can build a more just and inclusive future.